That morning, I dialed my son Daniel's number. My voice trembled as I asked Daniel, "When is your father's funeral? I want to make sure I'm ready." There was a pause, heavy and deliberate, like he was deciding whether to bother with words. Then his voice came through the line flat as stone. "We buried him yesterday." The coffee mug slipped from my hands and shattered across the floor. I stared at the mess, the dark liquid spreading across the tiles, and for a moment I thought I hadn't heard him right. My ears rang. My throat tightened so hard I couldn't swallow. "You what?" I managed, my voice breaking. "We buried him yesterday," he repeated slower this time, as if I were a child too slow to understand. "It's done. Don't worry about it." My knees buckled and I slid into the kitchen chair like all the air had been punched out of me. My own son had buried his father, my husband of 4 decades, without me. No call. No chance to say goodbye. No seat at the service. Not even a folded program with his name printed inside. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, hoping this was some twisted joke. "Daniel, how could you? Why didn't you tell me?" he sighed. "Mom, funerals are expensive, complicated. We handled it. You weren't in any shape to deal with it." I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My hand trembled so badly I could hardly set the phone back in its cradle. I looked at the broken mug on the floor, the brown stain spreading wider, and thought how fitting it was. A home shattered, a family spilled out and wasted, and no one even trying to clean it up. The kitchen felt colder than the Ohio winter outside. I could still see Frank's recliner across the room, the blanket folded over its armrest. Just last week I was holding his hand whispering prayers as the machines beeped faintly in the hospice wing. I had promised him I'd be there at his funeral, that I'd stand by his grave, that I'd make sure his memory was honored. And now, because of my own son, that promise had been stolen from me. I pressed my palm against my chest as though I could hold my heart together. In that moment, something in me cracked deeper than grief. Betrayal by strangers is cruel, but betrayal by your own blood, that's something worse. I sat there for hours, numb, replaying Daniel's words. "We buried him yesterday." Each time they sounded sharper, like a knife carving away any illusion that I still had a family. The clock ticked on, the coffee stain dried. But inside, I felt like I had been lowered into the grave right alongside my husband. And that, dear listener, was the beginning of the darkest fight of my life. Not just to bury my husband with dignity, but to defend my own name, my sanity, and my freedom. My name is Evelyn Harper. I turned 62 this past April. For most of my life, I was a second-grade teacher in Dayton, Ohio. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady and it gave me something to pour myself into after my long days at home. My husband Frank used to say I had the patience of a saint, though he teased that dealing with 30 restless 7-year-olds every day was probably harder than putting up with him. He wasn't wrong. Frank and I met in the late 70s at a county fair. He was 22, broad-shouldered grease under his nails from working in his father's auto shop. I was barely 20, holding a lemonade wearing a sundress that my mother had sewn. He asked if he could buy me another drink, and from then on we were inseparable. We built a life the old-fashioned way, saving for years to buy a modest house with blue shutters, raising one son Daniel, and making do without extravagance. For decades, Frank worked long hours as a mechanic. His hands were calloused, always smelling faintly of oil and metal, but when he came home, he would kiss me softly and ask how my day went. He didn't say much, but he showed his love in the way he fixed everything. Squeaky doors, broken toasters, even the neighbor's lawnmower when it sputtered out. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and I always thought our son grew up seeing that kind of love as his foundation. Daniel was a bright child. I remember him at age 10 lying on the living room rug with his Lego sets telling me he was going to design skyscrapers someday. But as the years went on, he grew restless, impatient. College came and went. He switched majors twice, then dropped out entirely. Jobs didn't stick. He always had big dreams. Real estate, tech startups, fast money schemes, but never the discipline to see them through. Frank and I worried, of course, but we kept hoping he'd find his footing. When he got married at 27 to a woman named Melissa, I prayed stability would follow. Instead, the calls for help started. Rent overdue, car payments late. Melissa was pregnant, he said, or she might lose her job. Could we help just this once? Of course we did. Parents don't stop being parents because their children stumble. Over the next few years, Frank and I paid more than I care to admit. Credit card bills, health insurance premiums, even the down payment on Daniel's townhouse. Every time he promised to pay us back. Every time it was the last time. And every time I told myself that maybe this time he meant it. But as Frank's health declined, the requests never stopped. At 60, my husband was diagnosed with lung cancer. Treatment was expensive, and though Medicare covered some, the bills stacked high. I cashed out part of my retirement savings, over $48,000, because what else could I do? My husband's life was worth more than numbers on a page. I thought surely Daniel would step up then help us shoulder the weight. But when I asked, he looked away and muttered about tough economic times. Instead of pitching in, he came by only to ask when Frank might make things easier by putting him on the house deed. I can still see Frank's jaw tighten, his hands trembling not just from illness but from anger. He didn't want to believe our son cared more about inheritance than his father still breathing in the next room. I tried to excuse Daniel. Stress bills, Melissa's influence. Anything but the truth I didn't want to face, that our only son was growing cold, that he saw us less as parents and more as a wallet with legs. Still, Frank and I clung to our routines. Sunday dinners, church potlucks, nights when we'd sit side by side watching old westerns while I crocheted and he drifted to sleep. We thought love and loyalty would carry us through, even if Daniel was lost for a while. What we didn't know then was that his absence at the hospital, his impatience at our table, his silence during long nights were not signs of distraction. They were rehearsals for something much crueler. For the moment when he would decide that his father's final goodbye wasn't worth his mother's presence. By the time Frank entered hospice care, our little house had grown too quiet. Machines hummed softly in the corner of our bedroom, and nurses rotated in and out with polite smiles that never quite reached their eyes. I barely slept. Every night I sat in the armchair by his bed, knitting or reading psalms aloud, anything to remind myself that as long as his chest rose and fell, I still had a purpose. That's when Daniel started showing up again, but not the way I had prayed for. The first time he came, he carried no flowers, no card, not even a cheap balloon that said, "Get well soon." He walked past his father's bed without a pause and sat down at the kitchen table with a stack of papers. I followed him in, wiping my hands on my apron, thinking maybe he had bills to show me or medical questions. Instead, he slid a deed across the table. "Mom," he said, his tone rehearsed, "it's just practical. If Dad passes, it's better for me to be on the title now. That way, probate doesn't get messy." I stared at him, blinking. "Your father is still alive in the next room." Daniel leaned back, folding his arms. "I'm just thinking ahead. Melissa's cousin is in real estate. He said it's smart." My stomach turned. Frank called out from the bedroom, his voice raspy, and I rushed back to him. When I told him later what Daniel wanted, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, something between heartbreak and fury. His hands trembled not from chemo, but from the realization that his only son was circling him like a vulture. The visits didn't improve. One Sunday, I had spent all morning cooking a roast, setting the table with the good china because I thought maybe the smell of food would comfort Frank and maybe Daniel would eat with us, remind me of when we were a family. But Daniel barely touched his plate. Halfway through the meal, he stood, muttered something about a client call, and left his food half-eaten, the roast growing cold, while Frank coughed weakly in his chair. The cruelest moment came a week later. Frank had taken a turn for the worse, and the nurse gently explained that he might not have many days left. I called Daniel, my voice breaking, asking if he could come sit with his father even just for an hour. His reply still echoes in my ears. "Mom, funerals are expensive. Don't expect me to pay a dime if you want a big show that's on you." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles whitened. "I'm not asking for money. I'm asking you to see your father before it's too late." He sighed. "I'll try. No promises." And then the line went dead. That night, I returned to Frank's bedside, smoothing his blanket, trying not to let him see the tears in my eyes. He asked me softly, "Did Daniel say when he's coming?" I lied. I told him Daniel was busy, but would be here soon. Inside, something in me cracked. For decades, I had shielded my son from disappointment, making excuses, believing in the boy who once dreamed of skyscrapers. But in that hospice room surrounded by machines and silence, I realized my son's heart had hardened into something I barely recognized. I still hoped, though. I still told myself he would show up in the final moments, that he would take his father's hand, whisper goodbye, prove me wrong. But hope can be the cruelest detail of all because it keeps you waiting for someone who has no intention of coming. Frank passed on a rainy Monday morning. The hospice nurse was there, her hands folded gently over mine as the monitor went flat. I kissed his forehead, whispering prayers through the tears. 40 years of marriage dissolved into silence in a single breath. I was exhausted physically, emotionally, spiritually. The nurse suggested I stay a night at the hospital wing to rest, so I did. They gave me a small cot, and for the first time in days, I drifted into sleep. When I returned home, the house felt like a mausoleum. His recliner still held the dent of his body. His slippers sat neatly by the door, waiting for feet that would never come. In the fog of grief, I realized something practical needed to be done, planning the funeral. I hadn't seen Daniel at the hospice in those final days, but surely he'd want to help now. I picked up the phone with trembling fingers and dialed his number. "Daniel," I said softly, "we need to talk about the funeral. When is it? I want to prepare." There was a pause. A long, terrible pause. Then his voice came through clipped and impatient. "We buried him yesterday." The words slammed into me like a physical blow. I staggered, clutching the edge of the kitchen counter. What did you say?" "We buried him yesterday," he repeated, his tone flat. "It's done." My hand shook so violently I nearly dropped the phone. "Yesterday, without me." "Daniel, I'm his wife. How could you?" He cut me off. "Mom, you weren't in any condition. It was better this way. Fewer complications. Melissa and I handled everything. Fewer complications. That's what my presence had become an inconvenience. My chest burned a raw ache spreading through my ribs. I could picture it, mourners gathered, hymns sung, the casket lowered into the earth. And me, his wife, absent. Not because of chance or illness, but because my son had decided it would be easier if I were erased. The phone slipped from my hand. I stood frozen in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, driving with tears blurring my vision. I didn't remember the turns, only that my heart pulled me to the cemetery. When I arrived, the ground was damp from rain. I saw a patch of fresh earth, a scattering of wilted flowers, folding chairs still stacked to the side. I walked closer, my shoes sinking into the mud, and there it was. Frank's grave, covered but not yet settled. The grass around it was torn raw, as if the earth itself protested. I fell to my knees, clutching the wet soil. My skirt was ruined, my hands filthy, but none of it mattered. What mattered was that I hadn't been here when he was lowered down. I hadn't whispered my last goodbye as the casket descended. I hadn't stood where a wife should stand. Around me, the cemetery was silent, save for the distant caw of a crow. No family, no friends. Not a trace of the life we had built together. Just me and a mound of dirt that already felt colder than the grave beneath it. I pressed my palm against the earth and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Frank. I promised I'd be here." They didn't even give me the chance. That night, lying awake in our empty bed, I kept replaying Daniel's words. "We buried him yesterday." They echoed in my head like a cruel refrain. This wasn't neglect. This was deliberate. A choice. And choices have reasons. For the first time, grief gave way to suspicion. Why would my own son cut me out of his father's funeral? What else had he decided without me? The betrayal was complete, but it was only the beginning. The morning after I discovered Frank's grave, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of unopened mail. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the damp earth, the flowers already wilting, and Daniel's words pounding through my head. "We buried him yesterday." Grief should have consumed me, but something colder took its place, suspicion. Why had he rushed it? Why had he shut me out completely? I picked up the phone and called Father Thomas, the parish priest at St. Mark's. He answered gently, his voice warm but cautious. "Father," I said, my voice breaking, "I need to ask. When was Frank's funeral?" There was silence on the line, then a sigh. "Mrs. Harper." "I'm so sorry." "Yes, the service was held yesterday morning. Daniel told me you weren't well enough to attend." My hand tightened around the receiver. "Not well enough. He never asked me. He never told me." "I thought it was unusual," Father Thomas admitted. "I even asked if you wanted a smaller memorial later, but Daniel insisted he had your blessing." My stomach dropped. My blessing. A lie neat and simple. I thanked the priest and hung up my fingers, trembling. I felt dizzy, but I forced myself to keep digging. If Daniel had lied about that, what else had he forged? At the county office, I requested a copy of the burial authorization. The clerk gave me a sympathetic look as she slid the papers across the counter. My eyes scanned the page, and there it was, my name scrawled in messy ink at the bottom. Evelyn Harper, my signature. Except it wasn't mine. I pressed my thumb to the page tracing the letters. The H was crooked, the R looped wrong. I'd been signing my name for 62 years. I knew when it wasn't mine. My son had forged it. I felt the room spin. A kind young clerk brought me a glass of water asking if I was okay. I nodded, but inside I was shaking. When I returned home, my neighbor, Mrs. Klein, shuffled over from her porch. She was in her 70s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She took my hand in hers and whispered, "Evelyn, I saw people going in and out of your house last week while you were at the hospital. Daniel and Melissa. They carried boxes, papers. They looked hurried, like they didn't want anyone to notice." My heart pounded. "Boxes from my house." She nodded. I didn't want to intrude, but it felt wrong, like they were hiding something. Pieces began clicking together. The rushed funeral, the forged signature, the mysterious visit to my house. This wasn't just cruelty. This was calculation. That night, I sat at Frank's desk and pulled open the drawers. They looked emptier than before. Insurance documents, old bank statements gone. My hands shook as I rifled through the folders, but the evidence was clear. Daniel had taken more than his father's farewell. He had taken our future. I sank into the chair, my chest tight. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial, legal, dangerous. I whispered into the silence of the house, "Frank, I think our son is trying to erase me." And with that realization, my grief hardened into resolve. I wasn't just a widow anymore. I was a woman at war with my own blood. The forged signature was bad enough. But what I uncovered next was worse. It wasn't only about the funeral. Daniel had gone after everything Frank and I had built over 40 years. Frank had a modest life insurance policy through the auto shop where he worked. $250,000, not a fortune, but enough to help me stay afloat, pay off the house, and keep my retirement savings intact. He also left behind a small parcel of land outside Dayton, 10 acres he'd inherited from his father. We always thought of it as our legacy, something to pass down one day. When I called the insurance company to report Frank's death, the representative hesitated. "Ma'am, the claim has already been processed. Funds were released last week." I gripped the phone. Released to whom? "To the beneficiary of a record, your son, Daniel Harper. We have the authorization form on file, signed by you." My knees nearly gave out. Another forged signature, another theft. "Could you send me a copy of that form?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. When the fax machine whirred to life later that afternoon, I pulled the pages out with trembling hands. There it was again, my name forged in crooked ink, giving Daniel full authority over Frank's policy. I pressed the paper against my chest and let out a sob that turned into a growl. My own son had stolen his father's death benefit before his body was even cold. I wasn't done. I drove to the county records office to check on the deed to the land in Dayton. The clerk tapped at her keyboard, then looked up at me with pity in her eyes. "The property was transferred last week. It's under Daniel Harper's name now. The transfer form lists you as the grantor." I shook my head. "That is impossible. I never signed anything." The clerk pulled up the scanned document and turned the monitor so I could see. There, it was my name again, forged in the same crooked hand. The weight of betrayal pressed down so hard I could barely breathe. Not only had my son buried his father without me, he had buried our future too. He had stripped me of my husband's last gifts, the financial cushion he had worked for the land his father had cherished the dignity of standing at his grave. When I returned home, the mailbox held a letter from the bank. It was a courtesy notice about a new joint account opened by Daniel listing both our names. I knew immediately I had never signed for that either. He was consolidating, taking over, erasing me from every ledger and record as surely as he had erased me from Frank's funeral. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the paper spread out before me, the forged burial authorization, the insurance claim, the land deed, the bank notice. My tears blurred the ink, but through the haze, I saw something clearly. This wasn't just neglect or cruelty. It was fraud. It was theft. It was an attempt to declare me powerless, to turn me into a ghost while I was still alive. I whispered into the darkened kitchen, "Frank, he's taken everything. But I won't let him take me." Resolve, hardened in my chest. I was no longer just a grieving widow. I was a fighter, and I would not go quietly into the silence my son tried to bury me in. By the next morning, I knew I couldn't fight this battle alone. My dining table looked more like a crime scene than a home paper spread out in messy piles, signatures that weren't mine staring back at me like silent accusations. I needed help, someone who could make sense of the mess, someone who could stand beside me when my own son had turned into an adversary. The first person I called was Margaret, an old friend from church. She used to practice law before retiring, and though she mostly spent her days tending her rose garden now, she still had the sharpest mind I knew. When she arrived, I laid everything out before her, the forged documents, the insurance forms, the deed transfer. She adjusted her glasses and studied the pages carefully. After a long silence, she looked up at me. "Evelyn," she said softly, "this isn't just family betrayal. This is felony fraud. He could go to prison for this." I swallowed hard. Prison. The word felt too heavy, too final. This was my son. But then I remembered Frank's grave, the flowers already wilting, and the empty chair at the funeral that should have been mine. Compassion wavered under the weight of what Daniel had done. Margaret continued, "You need real representation. I'll refer you to a colleague of mine, Aaron Blake. He's young, sharp, and not afraid to take on difficult cases." That afternoon, I met Aaron in his office downtown. He listened quietly as I recounted everything, how I'd been excluded from Frank's funeral, how Daniel had forged my signature, how the insurance money and land had vanished. His pen scratched across a yellow legal pad, but his eyes never left mine. When I finished, he leaned forward. "Mrs. Harper, you have more than enough for a case. We'll file motions to freeze the insurance payout, challenge the deed transfer, and pursue criminal charges for forgery. But I'll be honest, this will get ugly. Your son will fight back. He'll try to paint you as incompetent, maybe even unstable." I straightened in my chair. "Let him try. I've spent my whole life holding my family together. I may be grieving, but I am not incompetent." Aaron nodded. "Good. We'll need witnesses to back that up." That's when Linda, the hospice nurse, came into the picture. When I reached out, she didn't hesitate. "Mrs. Harper, I saw you every day," she told me over coffee. "You were alert, making decisions, advocating for Frank. If anyone says otherwise, I'll testify." Even Father Thomas agreed to help. When I explained what had happened, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I trusted Daniel when he said you approved. If I'd known the truth, I would have never gone through with it. I'll put that in writing." And then there was Mrs. Klein, my sharp-eyed neighbor. When Aaron interviewed her, she described seeing Daniel and Melissa hauling boxes from my house while I was at the hospital. "They looked nervous," she said, "like thieves in the night." Piece by piece, my network of allies grew: a retired lawyer, a young attorney, a hospice nurse, a priest, a neighbor. People who believed me when my own blood did not. For the first time since Frank's death, I felt a flicker of hope. That night, I gathered the documents into a neat binder labeling each section Funeral Authorization Insurance Property Bank. It was more than evidence, it was armor. And as I slid the binder across the table to Aaron the next morning, I felt something stir in me I hadn't felt in weeks: strength. Daniel had tried to bury me alongside Frank, but he'd underestimated one thing. A mother may grieve, but she doesn't forget how to fight. Aaron told me we needed more than documents. We needed Daniel to show his true face. "If he slips, if he admits even a fraction of what he's done, we'll have leverage," Aaron said. So I invited Daniel and Melissa over for dinner. It was the first time since Frank's death that they had stepped into my home without demanding papers or money. I cooked a simple meal: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. The smells filled the house, a faint echo of the family dinners we once shared. But the air was tight, brittle, like a glass ready to shatter. When they arrived, Melissa's perfume hit me before her voice did, sweet, cloying, like she wanted to mask something sour underneath. She kissed the air near my cheek and slid into her chair without so much as a glance toward the framed photo of Frank on the mantel. Daniel followed, loosening his tie, acting as though this were just another ordinary evening. We ate in silence for a few minutes. I pushed food around my plate, my appetite gone. Then I cleared my throat. "Daniel," I began softly, "I need to ask you something. Why didn't you tell me about your father's funeral?" He set down his fork, annoyed. "Mom, we've been over this. You weren't in any condition. It was better for everyone." Melissa added, her voice sharp. "Honestly, Evelyn, you should be grateful we handled it. Do you know how stressful planning a funeral is? My hands trembled under the table, but I steadied my voice. Grateful I missed saying goodbye to my husband because of you. Daniel rolled his eyes. He was gone, Mom. The funeral was just a ceremony. Don't be dramatic. Something inside me snapped. I reached down beside my chair and lifted a small recorder onto the table. With a quiet click, I pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the room, captured from a phone call weeks earlier. Funerals are expensive, Mom. Don't expect me to pay a dime. Melissa's face drained of color. Daniel's jaw tightened. You were recording me, he hissed. I leaned forward. No, Daniel. I was protecting myself. You've lied, forged, stolen, and buried your own father without me. Do you really think no one would ever hold you accountable? Melissa stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. Let's go. But before they could leave, Mrs. Klein's voice floated in from the doorway. She had agreed with Aaron to stop by that evening just in time. Ridiculous, she said, stepping into the room. I saw you and Daniel carrying boxes out of this house while Evelyn was at the hospital. What was in them? Melissa froze. Daniel's face flushed crimson. I stood slowly, my knees steady beneath me. You thought I was alone. You thought I was weak. But I have witnesses. I have evidence, and I have the truth. For the first time, Daniel looked cornered. He stammered, Mom, I was just trying to protect you, to make things easier. I stared at him. The boy I had once rocked to sleep, now a man who had robbed me of dignity and stolen his father's legacy. Protect me. You tried to erase me. Melissa grabbed her purse, muttering about lawyers. Daniel followed her out, but not before slamming the door so hard the picture of Frank rattled on the wall. The house fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence this time. Not grief, not fear. It was the silence before a storm breaks, the kind that tells you the fight has only just begun. That night, Aaron called. That recording the neighbor's statement, it's enough to shake him. But the real battle will be in court. Are you ready? I looked at Frank's photo on the mantel, his steady eyes meeting mine through the glass. Yes, I whispered. For him, I'm ready. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old paper, the kind of scent that clung to oak benches and worn carpet. I clutched my binder of evidence so tightly my knuckles ached. This was it, the day my son would face what he had done, and the day I would have to stand tall even if my knees trembled underneath me. Daniel arrived with Melissa at his side, both dressed sharply in dark suits. Melissa wore a smirk as if she already knew the ending of the story. Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes, but I caught the way he squared his shoulders, rehearsing arrogance like armor. The opposing counsel began with exactly what Aaron had predicted. They painted me as incompetent. Mrs. Harper is grieving unstable and unfit to manage complex financial matters, the lawyer declared. Her son acted responsibly in making swift decisions. I felt my chest tighten, but Aaron touched my arm gently. Patience, he whispered. When it was our turn, Aaron rose. His voice was calm, deliberate. Your Honor, this case is not about grief. It is about fraud. We intend to show that Daniel Harper deliberately forged his mother's signature to claim his father's life insurance transfer property and exclude her from funeral arrangements. This was not protection. This was theft. He began laying out the binder page by page. The forged burial authorization, the life insurance claim form, the deed transfer. Each signature compared against my driver's license and bank documents, my authentic hand steady and distinct. The differences were plain glaring, even to untrained eyes. Then came the witnesses. Father Thomas took the stand first, his clerical collar crisp against his black suit. Daniel told me Mrs. Harper approved the funeral arrangements, he said solemnly. I see now that was untrue. I was misled. Next was Linda, the hospice nurse. She spoke firmly, her hands folded in her lap. Mrs. Harper was present, attentive, and making medical decisions up to the final hours. At no point did she seem incompetent. In fact, she was her husband's strongest advocate. Melissa shifted uncomfortably at the defense table. Then Mrs. Klein, my neighbor, shuffled up with her cane. Her voice was thin, but sharp as glass. I saw them, she said, pointing straight at Daniel and Melissa, carrying boxes out of her home while she was away. They didn't want anyone to notice. But I noticed. Aaron pressed play on the recorder next. Daniel's own voice filled the courtroom. Funerals are expensive, Mom. Don't expect me to pay a dime. The words hung heavy in the air. Even the judge arched an eyebrow. The defense scrambled. Daniel's lawyer tried to argue that the signatures were variations and that the recording was taken out of context, but the momentum had shifted. I could feel it like the air after a thunderclap. Finally, it was my turn to speak. My legs shook as I walked to the witness stand, but when I looked at Frank's wedding band on my finger, I found my strength. I may be a widow, I said, my voice clear, but I am not incompetent. I have spent 40 years building a life with my husband. I deserved to stand at his grave. I deserved to decide how to honor him. My son did not just betray me. He betrayed his father's memory. The courtroom was silent except for the faint scratching of the stenographer's keys. When I stepped down, Aaron leaned close and whispered, "You did perfectly." The judge recessed briefly before returning with his ruling. His gavel struck once, echoing through the chamber. This court finds substantial evidence of fraud. The forged documents are invalid. The life insurance claim is reversed and shall be returned to Mrs. Harper. The property deed transfer is nullified. Furthermore, the matter of criminal forgery will be referred to the district attorney's office for prosecution. The sound of the gavel reverberated like thunder in my chest. I felt tears sting my eyes, not of grief this time, but of vindication. Daniel's face drained of color. Melissa whispered furiously to him, but for once he had no words. He looked at me then, just for a moment, and I saw something flicker, fear maybe, or the realization that the mother he thought he could erase had fought back and won. When the hearing ended, Aaron guided me out into the crisp afternoon air. Reporters lingered on the courthouse steps, their voices buzzing. I ignored them. I lifted my face to the sky, the autumn sun breaking through clouds, and for the first time since Frank's death, I felt warmth again. Justice had not brought Frank back, but it had restored my dignity, my voice, and the promise I had made to him that I would not let our life be stolen without a fight. The weeks after the hearing passed in a blur, but this time the silence in my house felt different. It wasn't the hollow echo of grief, it was space to breathe again. Papers were no longer scattered across my dining table. The forged documents, the recordings, the court transcripts, all of it had been boxed and stored with Aaron's firm. Evidence no longer defined my life. The first thing I did was plan a memorial for Frank. Not the rushed, secret burial my son had arranged, but a true service filled with love and memory. Father Thomas helped me reserve the chapel at St. Mark's. Friends from church brought casseroles and hymns. Linda, the hospice nurse, came too, holding my hand as we lit candles. When I stood at the lectern, the sanctuary glowing with soft light, I looked out at the faces, neighbors, old colleagues, even former students now grown with children of their own. I spoke of Frank's steady hands, his quiet humor, the way he fixed more than cars, he fixed lives with his patience and loyalty. And then, with a trembling voice but a steady heart, I said the words I had been denied weeks earlier. "Goodbye, Frank. This time I am here." Afterward, I walked to his grave with a small bouquet of white carnations. The earth had settled, the grass beginning to sprout again. I knelt, pressing the flowers gently into the soil, and whispered, "Rest easy now. Justice has been done." From that day forward, I began to set boundaries that had been unthinkable to me before. Daniel called once, leaving a message that swung between anger and desperation, but I never returned it. Melissa sent a letter filled with excuses and half apologies. I burned it in the fireplace without opening it fully. My locks were changed. My finances were transferred into new accounts. For the first time in decades, my life was mine alone. I also made a decision Frank would have approved of. I established a small charitable trust in his name, using part of the recovered insurance money. It would fund hospice care for families who couldn't afford it so that no one else would face the loneliness we had. Writing that check, I felt lighter than I had in years. The community responded in ways I hadn't expected. People came by with stories of their own neighbors betrayed by children over money, parishioners cut off from family at funerals or weddings. Each one reminded me that my pain wasn't unique, but my choice to fight back gave them courage. In time, I even found joy again in the small things, tending roses with Margaret in her garden, baking apple pies for church socials, reading bedtime stories to Mrs. Klein's granddaughter who had started visiting me after school. My house, once suffocating, became a place of laughter again. But I never forgot the lesson etched into my bones. Family is not guaranteed by blood. Family is measured by respect, by love, by presence in the moments that matter most. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun set in streaks of gold and crimson, I wrote in my journal, "My husband's death taught me grief. My son's betrayal taught me strength. and my fight for justice taught me that dignity is not something to be given, it is something to be defended. I closed the journal, feeling the weight of the pen in my hand, and smiled faintly. For the first time since Frank's passing, I felt whole again. Not because the pain was gone, but because I had turned it into something unbreakable. And if there's one thing I would tell anyone listening, it's this: never let betrayal silence you. Even when it comes from the ones you love most, your voice, your truth, and your dignity are worth protecting. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't just about losing my husband. It was about reclaiming myself.